Hey, what's up everybody? In today's video I want to talk about bindings, and specifically the timeline in development from the beginning of the sport to today, and taking you through a progression timeline of the materials, the designs, and the functionality of each generation. I've got 6 pairs of bindings here that go all the way back to the beginning of the sport, with bungee bindings, all the way to modern closed-toe bindings now. And I want to talk a little bit of each of those designs as we go along through the generation. We'll start off from the beginning. So in the late 80s, when the Scurfer and the McSkee and all of that came out, they didn't even have heel straps. They were just toe straps covering the forefoot of the your feet, and it was kept you connected to the board, but it was really tough to stay fully connected when you tried to do other tricks, especially when you try to go inverted. So Lance Brugge in the early 90s on Kauai at the World Championships in 1990 invented the first heel straps, and they became industry standard overnight. And you would see other companies starting to incorporate bungee heel straps along with the toe straps to keep them secure to the board. So it made going upside down and spinning much easier to learn. Then we went on to the mid 90s with actual boot bindings, obviously taking a little bit of design from water skiing and incorporating them into wakeboarding. The only problem with the boot bindings in the beginning was that they were very flimsy. Not a lot of support. Some would say it wasn't even better than the bungee bindings. If you look at Darren Shapiro, he wore bungee bindings until the 1995 season, when everybody else was already transitioned to boot bindings. So we're gonna start off talking about the Hyperlite or HO bungee strap binding. As you can see, it's very basic in design. It does have a little bit of a molded cushy footbed. The base plate is completely flat, but it does have a little bit of warping. Again, this was in the early generation of wakeboards. I would say somewhere between 91 and 93. You could adjust the toe strap based on how tight you wanted it, and technically you could adjust the heel strap bungee as well, but basically you made the adjustment for the tightness and the stiffness based on the toe strap. You could also see it had a bunch of holes along the side to give you your stance options that you would use a thumb screw to tighten down and secure yourself to the board. But again, as you can see, very basic in design, basically with the thought to just keep you connected to the board as best as you can. And even with this, you would still get some heel lift, obviously. At one point, a couple of manufacturers, I believe if it was Subrosa from Full Tilt, had 2 bungees with an adjustable forefoot overlay as well, to try and keep those riders from having any movement or detachment from the base plate and the footbed. Next, we're going to move on to the Hyperlite Team Power Boot with the Airshock base plate. Now, in the middle 90s, so around 95, 96, when the base plate came out, this Airshock base plate, it kind of revolutionized wakeboarding a little bit, because I know it's probably hard to see, but the design gave you a little bit of raise on the arch with these raised padded system, and it gets the name Airshock to basically give you the feeling that when you land, they get the design of the base plate and those raised footbeds or heel pads on the bottom of the base plate would absorb and give you a quote-unquote shock absorbing type of feel. And I would say when I first got on my first pair, this was in my first pair, I did feel that coming off of a really bad pair of Connolly boot bindings. These also had, again, these overlays that were very flimsy. The rubber is squeezable, not a lot of support. Does have a Velcro on the overlays where you could try to make it tighter over your forefoot or looser if need be. So there was a slight customization aspect to the binding, but this was the next step. Also, it was obviously much heavier. You had a lot more material, a little bit more, even though the base plate is aluminum, you had more material over the entire boot compared to the bungee, making the weight distribution a little bit heavier. You also, again, use those thumb screws, continue to use those thumb screws to connect yourself to the board. All right, a couple of years after the Hyperlite Team Power Boots came out, I remember in the end of the 1997 season watching the WWA World Championships on ESPN2 at the end of the season, and seeing some of the Hyperlite team riders with these new red overlays. Some had black rubber overlays or white overlays. I'm like, oh, what's that? What's Hyperlite coming out with next? And it ended up being the moon boots. And the moon boots basically, I would assume, get their name because of the white overlays and the white base plate, so you look like an astronaut, right? But there's a little bit of a development with regards to materials and design taken away that were progressed from the power boots. First thing was they incorporated again the Airshock base plate. However, the design changed where now, instead of having just one line of holes on each side of the base plate, they made it more adjustable for the rider. They had a couple of sections of holes on one side with slots on the other side to make it adjustable inward, outward, but also more left to right, to give the rider more options with regards to duck stances, less or more duck, also binding hole spacing, and so forth. So you got a lot more stance options with this base plate. Also, the materials on the overlays became much more sturdy and stable. They weren't as flimsy as the rubber that they used before. The base, footbed on the base plate now had some ridges and texture, which helped keep you more gripped on the landings, because before, when it was just flat, a lot of times if you fell weird or landed weird, your foot would actually slide forward in the binding. Sometimes you get stuck. I've even seen people's feet, the ankle, their heel, actually go out the front of the binding. So this would help prevent that. Also, the overlays had a dual texture on the back, so you still had some support, but the binding felt the same weight. It wasn't lighter, but it wasn't also heavier. Finally, like, if you can, I'm not sure if you can see, but the finger holes was kind of a warranty issue at the time, not just for Hyperlite, but other companies as well. But they would rip a lot. You'd have to, it was so hard to get in and out of the bindings. If you remember, a lot of, in that generation, we had to use shaving cream or some kind of soap like Dawn or some kind of commercial lubricant to help get your foot in and out of the binding. So you'd be pulling on the overlays to get your foot in, and then eventually they would rip. You would actually see some riders riding their boots without the top parts of their overlay. Hyperlite solved that issue by, instead getting rid of the finger holes and sewing in these back straps. They eventually put them on the toe straps as well, but basically it created a loop where you could put your fingers through, get more leverage, and you had a lot less chance of ripping the binding and the overlay. Also, what came into the industry in those years were G-bolts. Now, G-bolts were the next answer to thumb screws. And thumb screws, the problem with thumb screws was that it had a very small point of contact connecting the base plate to the board. So you probably can't see it, but this base plate is warped. Some of the one side's more warped than the other, just from the pressure, because you had such a small area of coverage with a thumb screw. Well, the G-bolts ended up having a little bit more surface area to them, securing your binding to the board much better, and minimizing or reducing the chances of getting more warp and getting disconnected from your board. Also, they look really cool. They came in anodized aluminum, different colors, so you could spot match them to your graphics on the board. But I remember when G-bolts came out, they were a really cool item. Okay, before I move on to the next set of bindings, I did want to mention Wiley's ProBuild bindings. Now, I don't have a set. I never owned one myself, but they were the cat's meow in the mid-90s. If you were anybody in wakeboarding, you had a pair of Wiley's ProBuilds. That was the premier bindings to have in wakeboarding. Created by Darren Wiley out of Washington, and obviously a legendary name in the water sports industry. And this was before really companies started focusing a lot of energy and resources into creating their own bindings. Yes, you did have some companies obviously making bindings themselves, but the quality and again the construction wasn't great. Wiley's was the first, in my opinion, to really take the idea that we needed to make sure that the riders were secured to the board and had the best form-fitting binding on the market. And I would say that probably 90%, if not more, of the riders were on Wiley's bindings at the time. And eventually that led into brands starting their own companies like Concrete or Soulbound bindings. And so shout out to Darren Wiley for leading the charge when it came to binding development. Okay, so after the moon boots came out in 1998, just a year later, in 1999, into the 2000 season, big industry shakeup. Scott Byerly switched over from Wake Tech to Hyperlite, and typically when a rider of his stature comes over to a new company, they start off right away with a pro model board. But instead of giving him a pro model board, they gave him a pro model binding. Again, it incorporated a lot of the same attributes as the moon boots and the team boot, the team power boot before that, with the Hyperlite Airshock base plate. But a couple of things stood out with the 3060 that was new in the industry. Number one was the design. Basically, if you think about graphics, there was a really unique look and color scheme to the bindings. Number two, the materials continued to get better. The overlays weren't ripping as easily. They were more secure to the base plate, and the footbeds actually became thicker and actually heat moldable. I remember getting my first pair of 3060s in 2000, and I put them on my board and put it in a jacuzzi, and after that I never had any problems with my feet getting sore or falling asleep during even a long session. But the biggest thing was, like I said before, was a heel lacing system that let you tighten up once you got into the binding, and when you were done, you could release the lace, and it was so much easier to get out of. Again, I don't know how many cans of shaving cream or bottles of Dawn we went through getting in and out of bindings back in the day, but this revolutionized making it much more functional and easier to get in and out of bindings. It does feel a little bit heavier than even the moon boot and the team power boot, but that's again just, it has a little bit more materials with some of the additional overlays and with a thicker footbed on the bottom. Now fast forward to the modern generation. Now over the last few years, you know, closed toe bindings really became a thing in the late 2000s, and basically they're the industry standard now, even for beginners. Open toes are still available for most brands out there, but basically everyone goes to closed toes. And at first I wasn't a big fan of closed toes, but eventually I was through some R&D work and just obviously making the adjustment. I'm fully bought in, obviously, having ridden closed toes for the last 10 to 15 years now. Basically, the design, one of the advantages to the closed toe was, number one, if you ride in a cold weather environment or seasonal environment where it's cold in the early part of the year or in the ending part of your season, it kept your feet a lot warmer when you were in the water. Number two, you did get a little bit more support overall through the boot, and basically you felt really connected and much more responsive to the board, which then translated to your ride on the water. Boots did start to get a little bit higher in the support. Even if you compare it to the previous generations, they were probably a good inch to inch and a half lower in height. And the laces, the lacing systems that became very prevalent in the industry were a little bit lower. Now they come up a lot higher, so you can customize how much support that you like. There's some riders that like a loose fitting binding, so they can tweak out, and it makes it easier to grab tricks when they're in the air. For me, I like a tighter fitting boot. Again, not having any type of heel lift or movement with my foot within the binding. The materials overall improved a lot as well. The liners were padded liners now, heat moldable to your feet, whether you use hot air or hot water or some kind of heat moldable type of process. And also the base plates became much stronger. In the beginning, base plates were cracking left and right, but through years of development, all the companies started to figure out which materials were the most durable. Also, your stance range ended up starting to get a little bit more narrow. You didn't need such a wide angle or like in the previous base plates that they used to have. Also, they started to use these claws instead of thumb screws or the G-bolts. You would use these claws that would secure. You probably can't see right now, but I'll show a close-up. But the base plate has these teeth in the ridges where the claws will lock in and secure your binding to the board much easier. A lot of times when you use thumb screws or even the G-bolts, they would come loose as you would ride, but the claws started to hold and secure your bindings to the board much better. Basically, every brand had some version of a quote-unquote claw type locking system. Now they're very small and a lot lighter. The lacing system on the Infuse, again, 2 lacing system. There were some bindings that just had 1 or even had 3. I think 2 is probably the optimal. It covers your forefoot as well as your upper ankle area to get, again, your customized secure fit on how much you like it. I would say just one thing when it comes to using a lace type locking system. When you release the lock or push it down, you want to make sure that the locking mechanism isn't engaged until it's actually in the lock position, and then you secure it by pushing down on the lever. If you try to push down the locking mechanism with the lever in place, it'll eat away at the outer sheath of the lace, and that's what ends up eating up your lace a lot quicker, and you'll end up snapping them. I don't know how many times I'd be on the back of the swim platform, and this is before I even thought about it, which made sense, but you'd be on the deck and all of a sudden snap, and then you gotta either spend an extra 10-15 minutes swapping out for a new lace, and that's if you had a lace available, or maybe your ride was done because you couldn't secure your foot into the binding. Finally, I want to talk about Velcro. So Velcro is nothing new. It's been in the industry for at least 15 years now. Multiple companies use some version of Velcro type system. The O'Brien Quattro, which replaced the GTX last year, is our highest end binding in the lineup. But I really love the ease and functionality of just opening up the Velcros. The tongue overlay really opens up wide, easy to get in and out of. The overlays are the same as, like I said, with the Infuse bindings. But again, you can customize how tight or how loose you want your fit based on how much pressure you add into the strap. And I can get a lot of leverage. And again, I like my bindings tight, so I can create a lot of leverage with the Quattro. I would say this is probably one of the highest bindings in the industry, certainly in the O'Brien lineup. It's about a 1/4 inch higher than the GTXs were last year, but with the new design cut in the back of the boot, it makes it much easier to get comfortable, and when you're in a dorsiflex position, it just molds and follows the contour of your movement, whereas before, when it was just, most bindings are cut level across the top of the boot, you know, you can get some rubbing and it takes a little bit of time to break that in and get it soft. None of that now. With the way the upper layers are cut on the tongue overlay and the heel overlay, it just follows the contour of your calf and your shins right away. Well guys, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a little something in our industry about binding development and technology. And when you're picking out your next pair of bindings, it'll give you a little bit more information on what you like. I was always a lacing guy. Once laces came into the industry, I had a couple of pairs of 3060s, and then eventually, you know, when I switched over to O'Brien in the early 2000s, all my bindings had some form of a lacing system until the Velcro came out in the early 2000, right around 2010-11. I switched over finally in 2014 and haven't looked back. I really love the feel and the functionality of that. But whatever you choose, hopefully again this video will help you in making your decision. And if you have any questions or comments, drop them in the section below. And if you enjoyed this video and you haven't subscribed, maybe consider doing that. I'd really appreciate it. All right, you guys have a great day. Aloha.